Everybody's going to work, and you look out the window, and there's kids running down the street laughing, and you're just like, how can you be out there playing? My daughter's dead. Kaylee Gonzalez is gone. Stop everything. Everybody in the whole world, stop.
The night Kaylee Goncalves was murdered, a quiet college town believed it was safe, and that belief would be shattered before sunrise. 4 students.
There are 4 very, very important names in this case. Kaylee Gonzalez, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin.
1 house, no forced entry, and a silence so deep that investigators later said the absence of sound was the most terrifying detail of all. How could something this brutal happen without anyone noticing? And why did early clues point investigators in one direction only to pull them somewhere far darker? Picture a town where porch lights stayed on all night, doors were rarely locked, and students believed danger existed somewhere else, not here. Now here is where the case takes its first unsettling turn. Just when police believed they were close to answers, a single overlooked detail surfaced, and suddenly nothing made sense anymore. Investigators thought they understood the timeline. They thought they knew who had access. They thought motive would be obvious. But then a clue emerged, small, quiet, almost invisible, that forced detectives to question everything they thought they knew. Why didn't it fit the original theory? Why did it appear after critical decisions had already been made? And why did it suggest that someone may have been watching far longer than anyone realized? This was the moment the case stopped being straightforward and started haunting investigators. Because just as the case seemed close to resolution, another discovery surfaced, and it changed the direction of the investigation overnight. A college town began locking doors. Parents began calling their children every night, and investigators began asking a chilling question they hadn't asked before. What if the danger wasn't random? What if it wasn't impulsive? What if it had been quietly building, unnoticed, right in plain sight? This documentary follows every verified detail, every turning point, and the critical clue that flipped the case on its head. The clue that shook the investigation and shocked an entire nation. And once you hear it, you'll understand why this case still refuses to let go. On the night of November 12, 2022, the town of Moscow, Idaho, exhibited no unusual activity in the vicinity of the King Road residence where Kaylee Goncalves and other students lived. Local surveillance cameras captured standard vehicular and pedestrian patterns, with no recorded interruptions or anomalies prior to 11 p.m. Witnesses in neighboring apartments reported typical residential noises consistent with a college town evening, including muted conversations, television audio, and occasional doors opening and closing. Police reports confirmed that the exterior of the residence appeared intact, with front and back doors seemingly secured, and no signs of forced entry. Preliminary forensic assessment noted partial fingerprints on the front door, but laboratory analysis concluded that these markers were inconclusive and a unique match could not be established. Despite the apparent normalcy, the following morning revealed multiple victims within the home, indicating that a breach occurred during the night. The absence of forced entry conflicts with the observed security of the residence, suggesting either prior access or entry without conventional disruption. Canine alerts inside the residence indicated movement through interior spaces that could not be traced to the victims themselves. Digital analysis of surrounding Wi-Fi networks indicated that a device connected passively to a network associated with MedGreek, a local restaurant where 2 of the victims had previously been employed. While this connection could not confirm presence at the time of the crime, it introduces an inconsistency between external normalcy and internal vulnerability. How was the perpetrator able to gain access to the residence without triggering alarms or leaving identifiable signs of forced entry? Could the suspect have possessed a prior access to the property, or might there have been inadvertent access facilitated by a resident? Did the connection to local Wi-Fi networks indicative of surveillance or merely a coincidental prior association? Did the sequence of events involve observation of routines over days or weeks, allowing for strategic timing of entry? Early reports suggest a pattern consistent with premeditation. Partial DNA markers and fingerprints indicate movement in specific areas, including hallways and staircases that align with known bedroom locations. Surviving roommate testimony describes a perceived presence of an intruder prior to discovery, suggesting targeted observation. Canine alerts corroborate that the path of movement inside the house was deliberate rather than incidental. The combination of passive digital connections, eyewitness indications of prior monitoring, and absence of forced entry aligns with established stalking patterns documented in similar criminal investigations, where the perpetrator gains knowledge of routines and internal layouts to reduce risk of detection. Based on the documented facts, it is possible that the suspect either possessed prior access to the property or obtained information from observation, digital traces, or casual interactions. The lack of forced entry could suggest the use of a key, an unlocked door, or deliberate avoidance of locked entry points. It is likely that the perpetrator conducted reconnaissance, whether through repeated visits to nearby public locations or via passive monitoring of Wi-Fi signals associated with the victim's routines. Given the targeted movement within the residence, it is possible that Kaylee Goncalves and other occupants were specifically observed in their daily patterns, making them potential focal points for the intrusion. The motive, while not directly verifiable, could be linked to familiarity or prior attention to the victims rather than a purely random selection. Each element aligns with a theory of calculated observation preceding the act. The details raise significant questions regarding the timing, access, and sequence of the crime. What do you think? Could the perpetrator have had a key, or was access facilitated in some other way? How might prior observation or digital traces have informed the execution of the crime? As investigators continue to release public records, these early theories may be confirmed or refined, offering insights into the patterns of premeditated intrusion in what was otherwise a quiet college town. On the night of November 12, 2022, at approximately 8:15 a.m., law enforcement responded to a welfare check requested by neighboring university staff. The residence at 1122 King Road, shared by Kaylee Goncalves and other university students, was reported to have no response to repeated calls. Upon entry, officers observed multiple victims, including Kaylee Goncalves, located within separate bedrooms and common areas. The scene indicated that the events occurred during the late-night hours, as ambient lighting and forensic assessment of body temperature suggested no significant delay between time of death and discovery. Initial documentation included photographs showing red-colored liquid consistent with blood on staircases, hallways, and bedroom floors, as well as smears on walls and furniture. The placement of the victims, with some in beds and others in open spaces, suggested that the intruder's movement was deliberate and focused. No signs of robbery were initially apparent. Valuables remained in situ and electronic devices were undisturbed. While the scene indicated careful movement inside the residence, this contradicts the lack of forced entry previously documented. The front door was found in a closed but unlocked state, and back doors showed no signs of recent tampering. This creates an inconsistency between observed interior chaos and exterior security. Furthermore, preliminary forensic analysis revealed partial DNA markers in multiple locations. However, the sample yielded partial profiles insufficient for unique identification. Canine alerts suggested pathways consistent with the intruder moving purposefully from room to room, yet these pathways do not correlate with any obvious point of external entry, presenting a contradiction between available evidence and typical forced entry scenarios. How could the perpetrator have accessed the residence without triggering conventional security measures? Could the suspect have had prior knowledge of the building layout, or was entry opportunistic, facilitated by an unlocked door? Was the intruder familiar with resident routines, enabling precise timing to encounter occupants individually? Does the lack of theft suggest the primary intent was personal rather than opportunistic, or could the crime have served a different objective entirely? Observations from the scene align with documented behavioral patterns in cases involving targeted intrusion. Red liquid smears indicate movement consistent with direct contact with victims rather than accidental distribution, while stairwell patterns suggest deliberate navigation between floors. Surviving roommate testimony indicates that some residents sensed a presence prior to discovery, reflecting the possibility of stalking behavior. Partial fingerprints on bedroom surfaces and common areas, though inconclusive, suggest deliberate handling of objects or navigation through the environment. Combined with digital traces noted in Wi-Fi network logs connected to local establishments frequented by the victims, a pattern emerges consistent with reconnaissance, observation of daily routines, and possible selection of specific victims based on prior knowledge. Based on the documented facts, it is possible that the intruder either possessed prior access or exploited routine behaviors to enter the residence. The absence of forced entry could indicate knowledge of unlocked entry points or prior exposure to security patterns within the home. The deliberate movement throughout the interior and targeted positioning of victims suggests that the intruder might have had knowledge of individual locations or behavioral habits, enabling separation and control during the event. Given the lack of theft and preservation of personal property, the motive could be focused on specific individuals, potentially reflecting a pre-existing fixation or familiarity rather than random selection. The intruder's awareness of Wi-Fi networks associated with local establishments might indicate a broader pattern of observation, supporting the hypothesis of calculated premeditation. These observations prompt critical questions about access, intent, and preparation. What do you think? Could prior knowledge of the residents explain the lack of forced entry, or is there an alternative explanation? How might the observed patterns of movement and interaction within the house reflect calculated planning? As investigators continue to release reports and forensic analyses, these early theories may guide understanding of the sequence of events and potential motive in what became a morning that irrevocably altered a quiet college community. Upon arrival at the residence at 112 King Road, law enforcement documented a scene involving 4 victims, Kaylee Gonzalez and 3 other students, each located in separate rooms or sections of the house. The victims were discovered with injuries consistent with close-range assault, and multiple areas of red-colored liquid, likely blood, were observed along hallways, stairwells, and bedroom floors. The residence showed no clear signs of robbery, as personal belongings, including wallets, electronics, and jewelry, remained in place. Initial forensic examination indicated that all entry points were either closed or unlocked, with no damage consistent with forced entry. Partial DNA profiles were recovered from several locations, including bedroom doors and common areas. However, these profiles were incomplete, preventing a unique match. Canine alerts indicated the presence of a human scent moving through multiple floors, but the scent trail terminated at external points without definitive identification of an individual. Surveillance cameras in the surrounding neighborhood captured a white vehicle parked near the residence in the early morning hours, though no direct connection between the vehicle and the intruder could be immediately established. The absence of forced entry appears inconsistent with the interior chaos observed. While the intruder's movement through multiple rooms, navigation of stairwells, and interaction with victims suggests deliberate planning, exterior access points do not indicate breach or tampering. This creates a contradiction. If the perpetrator intended to reach multiple victims in separate locations, how could such coordination occur without knowledge of interior layout or access codes? Additionally, partial DNA evidence and canine alerts suggest human presence, yet no eyewitness accounts or video footage conclusively identify a suspect. The contradiction between the apparent precision of movement inside and the absence of forced entry or identifiable suspect raises questions regarding prior knowledge or opportunistic entry. Could the intruder have possessed prior familiarity with the residence or routines of its occupants? Was entry facilitated by an unlocked door or inadvertent access granted by a resident? Could the sequence of movement indicate surveillance and pre-planning, targeting specific individuals based on prior observation? How might the presence of the white vehicle relate to potential staging, observation, or departure from the scene? Were the victims selected opportunistically, or does the pattern suggest a targeted focus on certain occupants, such as Kaylee Gonzalez? Analysis of crime scene evidence demonstrates repeated movement between floors, concentrated interactions with each victim, and the presence of blood in motion, consistent with deliberate handling rather than accidental contact. Partial DNA markers and fingerprints, though insufficient for identification, indicate that the intruder physically contacted multiple surfaces. The lack of theft, coupled with meticulous navigation through the residence, aligns with known patterns of targeted intrusions in which a perpetrator seeks specific victims rather than valuables. Previous evidence, including Wi-Fi logs and previous sightings of potential surveillance near the residence, support the possibility of reconnaissance, observation of daily routines, and possible selection of specific victims based on prior knowledge. Based on the assembled facts, it is possible that the intruder either possessed prior access or exploited routine behaviors to enter the residence. The absence of forced entry could indicate knowledge of unlocked entry points or prior exposure to security patterns within the home. The deliberate movement throughout the interior and targeted positioning of victims suggests that the intruder might have had knowledge of individual locations or behavioral habits, enabling separation and control during the event. Given the lack of theft and preservation of personal property, the motive could be focused on specific individuals, potentially reflecting a pre-existing fixation or familiarity rather than random selection. The intruder's awareness of Wi-Fi networks associated with local establishments might indicate a broader pattern of observation, supporting the hypothesis of calculated premeditation. These observations prompt critical questions about access, intent, and preparation. What do you think? Could prior knowledge of the residents explain the lack of forced entry, or is there an alternative explanation? How might the observed patterns of movement and interaction within the house reflect calculated planning? As investigators continue to release reports and forensic analyses, these early theories may guide understanding of the sequence of events and potential motive in what became a morning that irrevocably altered a quiet college community.
These observations prompt further questions regarding access, premeditation, and selection of victims. What do you think? Does the pattern of movement and lack of forced entry suggest prior familiarity, or is there an alternative explanation? How might investigators leverage partial DNA, canine alerts, and digital evidence to reconstruct the sequence of events? As additional forensic analyses are released, understanding the intruder's approach and intent remains central to clarifying how a night of quiet activity transformed into a scene of multiple fatalities, raising broader questions about motive, planning, and victim targeting in a college town context. The autopsy reports, conducted by the Latah County Coroner's Office and reviewed by forensic pathologists, confirmed that all 4 victims succumbed to multiple sharp force injuries consistent with stabbing. Injuries were concentrated on the torso, neck, and upper extremities, suggesting close-range contact with a bladed instrument. The number of wounds per victim varied, with Kaylee Goncalves presenting with 22 separate lacerations, while other victims sustained between 10 and 16 significant cuts. Defensive wounds were present on the hands and forearms of 3 of the 4 victims, indicative of attempts to shield themselves during the attack. Toxicology reports indicated no presence of incapacitating substances, and no evidence of prolonged restraint was detected, suggesting that the intruder did not rely on chemical or physical immobilization prior to the assault. The distribution and nature of injuries indicate deliberate targeting rather than random infliction of harm. While the autopsy findings demonstrate a focused and controlled assault, they appear inconsistent with the lack of identifiable motive related to robbery, sexual assault, or interpersonal conflict documented in preliminary police interviews and victim profiles. The absence of theft or sexual contact contradicts the hypothesis of an opportunistic attack, yet the methodical nature of stabbing multiple victims suggests intent and selection. The targeted focus on specific body areas, along with defensive injuries, raises questions about whether the perpetrator had prior knowledge of each victim's location and behavior inside the residence. Furthermore, the presence of defensive wounds on only 3 of the victims introduces a potential contradiction. Why did one individual not exhibit these injuries? Could that indicate the order of attack,
or a difference in proximity? Or might it suggest that this individual was incapacitated differently or unexpectedly encountered the intruder? Could the pattern of wounds reflect premeditation aimed at specific individuals, particularly Kaylee Goncalves, given the increased number and placement of injuries? Was the sequence of attacks informed by prior observation of victim routines within the residence? How might the intruder have moved between rooms with minimal disruption while inflicting repeated forceful injuries? Does the absence of incapacitating substances suggest reliance on surprise, physical advantage, or psychological intimidation to control victims? Could the distribution of injuries indicate an adaptive response by the intruder to resistance or deliberate targeting of individuals perceived as primary versus secondary threats? Analysis of injury location and sequencing indicates repeated, controlled strikes directed at vital areas, consistent with deliberate intent to maximize harm and control. The defensive wounds corroborate interaction between victims and the intruder during close-range confrontation. Comparison across victims shows that the primary target, Kaylee Goncalves, sustained both the highest number of injuries and the most concentrated assaults on the torso, which could indicate a pre-selected focus or increased resistance during the attack. The pattern aligns with previously documented observations of intruder surveillance. Partial knowledge of the residence layout, occupant routines, and room positioning likely informed the sequence of movement, allowing the assailant to engage multiple targets efficiently while minimizing exposure. In the absence of theft, sexual assault, or other secondary motives, the pattern suggests a calculated act aimed at individuals rather than property. Based on the forensic evidence, it is possible that the perpetrator entered the residence with prior knowledge of room locations and occupants' positions, allowing for a sequential and targeted assault. The injuries suggest that the intruder could have prioritized certain victims, potentially focusing on Kaylee Goncalves as the primary target and adjusting movements according to resistance encountered. The absence of incapacitating agents or forced restraint indicates reliance on surprise, proximity, and controlled physical engagement. Defensive injuries demonstrate interaction but do not negate the possibility of planning, as the intruder may have anticipated resistance and prepared accordingly. Given the concentration of wounds and methodical approach, it is likely that the assault was premeditated with knowledge of residence layout and victim positioning, rather than a random or opportunistic act. These findings provoke further questions regarding the intruder's planning, sequencing, and selection of victims. What do you think? Does the distribution of injuries indicate a single primary target, or were all victims intended to be engaged equally? How might investigators leverage the autopsy data alongside surveillance, DNA, and digital evidence to reconstruct the precise movements and intent of the assailant? Understanding the methodology behind the attack is essential to determining motive, premeditation, and whether patterns observed in this case align with broader behavioral profiles in similar intrusions. As additional forensic and investigative details emerge, the deliberate nature of the assault continues to provide critical insight into the sequence, planning, and potential targeting decisions made by the perpetrator. According to police reports and interviews with surviving roommates, the initial discovery of the crime scene occurred following unusual silence and lack of response from occupants of the residence. One roommate, upon waking and noticing abnormal conditions in common areas, attempted to contact emergency services. The 911 call was placed at 9:05 a.m., though early statements from law enforcement indicate that information relayed during the call was fragmented and the dispatcher received inconsistent details about the number of victims and their locations. The surviving roommates reported hearing disturbances during the night, including noises suggestive of movement in multiple rooms, but they did not immediately leave their rooms or summon help. Law enforcement reports also note that text messages between roommates during the early morning hours were delayed in sending due to intermittent cellular service and the physical layout of the house. While the evidence demonstrates an attempt to seek assistance, the delay and partial reporting contradict expectations for immediate action in a high-risk situation. Roommates were aware of intrusions in the residence, yet the sequence and timing of 911 reporting do not correspond precisely with the moments of observed disturbance.
Additionally, the presence of clear visual cues such as open doors and the arrangement of rooms suggesting unusual activity should have prompted immediate evacuation, yet those actions were not taken. This inconsistency raises questions about how perception, fear, and spatial layout may have affected decision-making under stress. Could the surviving roommates' delayed reporting reflect confusion in distinguishing between routine college noise and a threatening intrusion? Did the layout of the residence and visibility of certain rooms influence the urgency of the situation? Might the fragmented recollections indicate cognitive stress that temporarily impaired situational assessment, or does it suggest that the intruder's movements were deliberately designed to minimize detection? Could the timing of digital communications versus direct observation help reconstruct the intruder's sequence of movements within the residence? A review of the available data indicates a recurring pattern in which sensory observations, footsteps, voices, or unusual movement occurred shortly before text communications or the 911 call. The discrepancy between perceived activity and reporting suggests that the intruder's actions may have exploited spatial vulnerabilities or created deliberate ambiguity to delay outside intervention. Across multiple surviving roommate statements, there is a consistent theme of partial visibility and uncertain interpretation of events, which aligns with the physical layout of the residence: hallways, half walls, and staircases potentially limiting line of sight. Based on these facts, it is possible that the intruder deliberately used timing, stealth, and knowledge of interior spaces to minimize immediate detection and delay emergency reporting. The fragmented communications and delayed 911 call might be a consequence of both environmental constraints and acute stress responses by the survivors. It is likely that the intruder anticipated the potential for observation and manipulated movement through the residence to maintain control while reducing the likelihood of rapid external intervention. These circumstances raise critical questions about how situational awareness, environmental layout, and intruder behavior intersect in domestic attacks. What do you think? Could the intruder's movement through the residence have been planned to exploit these visibility gaps? Or was the delayed reporting solely due to stress and confusion? Understanding the interplay between intruder strategy and survivor response remains essential to reconstructing the timeline and assessing the potential for preventative interventions.
Following the public release of the initial police statement, authorities confirmed that there was no identified suspect in the murders of Kaylee Goncalves and the other victims. Law enforcement emphasized that the investigation remained active, though no arrests had been made, and forensic analysis was ongoing. Local media reports indicated that residents of Moscow, Idaho, expressed heightened anxiety, avoiding travel alone at night, locking doors more rigorously, and organizing informal neighborhood watch groups. The sudden emergence of a high-profile violent crime in a typically low-crime university town triggered national attention, with news outlets highlighting both the vulnerability of college students and the lack of immediate investigative breakthroughs. Officials received numerous calls from concerned citizens, but the lack of definitive suspect information generated frustration and speculative discussion on social media and local forums. Despite intensive community alertness and multiple tips submitted to law enforcement, the investigation yielded no immediate identification of a suspect. This contradiction, heightened vigilance paired with absence of actionable leads, suggests either that the perpetrator maintained significant operational security or that critical evidence had not yet been recovered. Residents reported sightings of suspicious vehicles and unfamiliar individuals in proximity to the campus, but police could not confirm these reports as connected to the crimes. The public perception of danger contrasted sharply with the investigative reality of limited forensic or eyewitness data at the time. Could the unknown suspect have planned the crime to avoid detection, possibly using knowledge of local routines or building layouts? Might the lack of forced entry indicate familiarity with the residents or pre-existing access, and how did that contribute to the difficulty in identifying a suspect? Was the public alarm amplified by national media coverage, or did actual risk to remaining residents justify heightened fear? How might the community's reactions influence investigative priorities, tip follow-up, or suspect behavior? Analysis of initial reports suggests a pattern of uncertainty and partial observation. Residents observed brief anomalies, but nothing conclusively linked to the intruder. The discrepancy between perceived danger and verifiable evidence mirrors prior cases where perpetrators exploited environmental knowledge and predictable routines to limit exposure. The combination of student housing layouts, dimly lit streets, and transient population likely contributed to both the perpetrator's ability to remain undetected and the community's escalating fear. Based on the evidence, it is possible that the perpetrator intentionally executed the crime in a manner designed to delay detection, potentially including silent movement, timing during early morning hours, and avoidance of witnesses. The lack of immediate suspect identification might indicate either deliberate planning by the intruder or gaps in initial surveillance and forensic data collection. It is likely that the combination of environmental familiarity and rapid departure contributed to the town's perception of an omnipresent threat while investigators worked to establish concrete leads. These circumstances raise critical questions about community awareness and crime prevention. What do you think? Could the intruder have used the town's routines and geography to evade capture, or was this a case of delayed investigative response? Understanding the interplay between perpetrator planning, environmental conditions, and public fear remains essential in reconstructing both the timeline and behavioral profile. Forensic examination of the crime scene and post-mortem reports indicated that Kaylee Goncalves sustained multiple stab wounds, concentrated primarily in areas consistent with a direct, purposeful assault. Investigators noted that her injuries differed in both location and severity compared to other victims, suggesting the possibility of differentiated attention during the attack. Surveillance footage from nearby streets revealed Kaylee entering the residence within a narrow time window prior to the attack. Witness statements and roommate accounts indicated that she had expressed a vague awareness of someone observing her in the weeks preceding the incident. Several digital footprints, including location pings associated with her routine movements, placed her frequently near communal areas of the campus and the nearby residential complex, though no direct suspect contact was documented prior to the night of the murders. Despite the indication that her injuries were more concentrated and severe, there was no clear evidence establishing her as the sole target. Other victims were attacked within the same time frame and location under similar circumstances, yet their injury patterns differed. The absence of forced entry contrasts with the potential assumption of a premeditated selection of Kaylee as a primary target, raising questions whether opportunity, chance, or intent shaped the sequence of events. The observed patterns of attention, including surveillance data and prior behavioral reports, provide partial support for a focused assault, but leave room for alternative explanations regarding the assailant's objectives. Could the suspect have been aware of Kaylee's movements and selected her specifically, or was her proximity to the residence coincidental within the perpetrator's broader plan? Might the lack of injury severity reflect a personal motive, a perceived vulnerability, or simply the dynamics of the attack? How do prior observations of her feeling followed factor into the determination of whether she was intentionally targeted? Review of roommate statements, witness reports, and digital records suggests a recurring pattern of observation and behavioral tracking. Kaylee had reportedly seen unfamiliar figures near her residence and expressed concern about being followed. While these reports do not definitively identify a suspect, they indicate repeated environmental awareness of her presence, contrasting with the less documented presence of other victims in similar contexts. Based on the facts, it is possible that Kaylee Goncalves might have been specifically targeted due to identifiable routines, visibility in communal areas, or prior interactions with the suspect. The likely sequence of injuries and timing reflects either selective attention or coincidental opportunity during a controlled attack.
While certainty cannot be established without additional corroborating evidence, the convergence of injury patterns, surveillance, and prior behavioral reports supports the hypothesis that she may have been the initial focus of the assailant's actions. These circumstances raise critical questions about community awareness and crime prevention. What do you think? Could the intruder have used the town's routines and geography to evade capture, or was this a case of delayed investigative response? Understanding the interplay between perpetrator planning, environmental conditions, and public fear remains essential in reconstructing both the timeline and behavioral profile.
Investigators reviewed multiple segments of surveillance footage from street cameras and nearby businesses in the hours preceding the discovery of the victims. The footage consistently captured a white sedan, described as a late-model four-door vehicle, circulating within a 2-block radius of the residence between 1:30 a.m. and 3 a.m. The vehicle was observed slowing near the home, pausing briefly at intersections and repeating circuits along adjacent streets. Witness statements corroborated seeing a similarly described vehicle parked intermittently outside the complex within the same time frame. Police logs indicate that no registered resident or guest had reported operating such a vehicle, and no vehicle registration immediately matched the license plate partially visible in the footage. Although the vehicle's repeated presence suggests surveillance or preparatory activity, no direct connection between the vehicle and the assailant has been established. No fingerprints, DNA, or physical evidence has been definitively linked to the white sedan. Furthermore, routine traffic in the area included multiple white sedans, introducing uncertainty regarding whether the footage represents the suspect's vehicle or an unrelated passerby. The contrast between observed activity and unverified ownership introduces ambiguity about the vehicle's relevance to the attack itself. Could the white sedan have belonged to an individual conducting pre-attack observation, or was it coincidental presence of a civilian vehicle? Might the repeated circuits indicate pattern surveillance of the residence, timing of entry, or monitoring of specific victims? Was the vehicle used as a staging point for the assailant, a mode of escape, or merely incidental to the neighborhood traffic flow? Analysis of the footage suggests a behavioral pattern consistent with reconnaissance. The vehicle's movements were deliberate, with pauses and directional changes at vantage points overlooking the residence and entrances. This pattern aligns with prior behavioral indicators from digital and eyewitness data showing attention to the residence and movements of the occupants. No other vehicles were noted conducting similar repeated loops, suggesting a non-random activity. Based on the available facts, it is possible that the white sedan might have been employed for observation purposes, either to time the entry into the residence or to confirm the presence of specific individuals. It is likely that the vehicle was used as part of a premeditated sequence rather than random circulation, though definitive attribution cannot be established without corroborating forensic evidence. The convergence of video surveillance, behavioral patterns, and absence of alternative explanations supports the hypothesis that this vehicle could represent an extension of the assailant's preparatory actions. The white sedan introduces a critical investigative dimension, emphasizing the importance of pre-attack reconnaissance and mobility in understanding the sequence of events. What do you think? Was the vehicle deliberately involved or merely coincidental presence? Determining its relevance could clarify motive, timing, and potential suspect identification, guiding further lines of inquiry. Investigators obtained cell phone records from the area surrounding the residence during the critical time window of the offense. Analysis indicates multiple pings from devices in close proximity to the residence between 12:45 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., suggesting late-night activity inconsistent with normal residential traffic. One device was linked to a Wi-Fi network regularly accessed by one of the victims, and records show intermittent connectivity that coincided with the vehicle surveillance described previously. Mobile service logs also reflected brief disconnections and reconnections, possibly indicating movement or attempts to avoid triangulation. Forensic specialists noted that the datasets were incomplete, some pings were inconclusive, and signal strength variations prevented precise location determination in several instances. While the digital data shows activity near the residence, no device could be conclusively linked to a specific individual at the time. Multiple devices in the area, including those belonging to residents, neighbors, and visitors, created a level of ambiguity. Furthermore, the presence of a device connected to the victim's Wi-Fi network could indicate either the victim's routine activity or unauthorized access by an external party, but the data alone cannot determine intent or physical presence. Legal reviews caution that such digital traces are circumstantial unless corroborated by physical evidence. Could the late-night pings represent deliberate surveillance, mapping the residence, or monitoring the victim's movements? Might intermittent connections reflect intentional attempts to avoid detection, or are they merely the result of technical fluctuations inherent to mobile networks? Was there coordination between vehicle movements and device activity, or are these parallel but unrelated phenomena? Despite limitations, a pattern emerges. Devices appear repeatedly near the residence during late-night hours, often aligning temporally with the white sedan's observed movements. The timing suggests purposeful presence rather than random traffic, and repeated connections to victim-associated networks could indicate familiarity with the residence's layout. No other locations exhibit the same frequency or temporal alignment, lending significance to this cluster of digital activity. It is possible that the digital trails represent preparatory surveillance or coordination related to the offense, particularly considered alongside vehicle observations and prior stalking behavior. The intermittent connectivity and repeated proximity indicate a deliberate attempt to monitor the victims while minimizing detection. While it is not possible to uniquely identify a specific individual solely from these records, the convergence of mobile activity, Wi-Fi associations, and timing with vehicle patterns supports the hypothesis that these digital footprints were likely part of a premeditated planning. Digital evidence introduces a complex layer to the investigation, highlighting how technology can both reveal and obscure intent. What do you think? Does the phone activity point to deliberate planning, or could it be coincidental? Understanding these patterns may prove critical in reconstructing the sequence of events and identifying possible suspects. Forensic investigators collected multiple biological samples from the crime scene, including blood, skin cells, and trace materials found on surfaces and objects within the residence. Laboratory analysis revealed a partial DNA profile from one of these samples, which could not be conclusively matched to any resident or known visitor at the time. Investigators submitted the profile to a national forensic genealogy database. Weeks later, genealogical methods produced a potential lead, a suspect residing several thousand miles away, identified through familial DNA connections. Public records confirmed that the suspect had no immediate, documented association with the victims or their residence, and no prior criminal history in the jurisdiction of the offense.
Despite the genealogical link, forensic services emphasized that the match was not a unique identification. The profile consisted of partial markers, and contamination or sample degradation could affect reliability. Additionally, the suspect's physical location, verified through travel and residential records, did not clearly place him in proximity to the scene at the estimated time of the crime. Law enforcement noted that relying solely on distant familial matches carries significant evidentiary limitations, requiring corroboration through physical evidence, digital trails, or witness testimony. Could the DNA have been transferred indirectly, for example, via contact with objects or surfaces shared by the victims? Might the suspect have been in the area temporarily, unrecorded by standard monitoring or digital means? Is it possible that the DNA represents background material present prior to the incident rather than a direct link to the offense? How can investigators reconcile the genealogical identification with the absence of traditional alibi evidence? Examining prior cases where forensic genealogy contributed to suspect identification reveals a recurring theme. Initial partial matches often require cross-referencing with circumstantial evidence, including travel history, digital activity, and behavioral indicators. In this investigation, the DNA discovery aligns temporally with vehicle sightings, phone activity, and indications of premeditated surveillance, suggesting that the partial genetic evidence may correlate with other investigative leads. While individually inconclusive, the convergence of multiple indicators strengthens the potential relevance of this forensic finding. It is possible that the DNA indicates the suspect's presence or contact with materials at the crime scene, whether directly or indirectly, and could reflect premeditation or planning. The partial markers suggest that while identification is not definitive, familial and circumstantial connections may guide further investigation toward corroborative evidence. The combination of genealogical linkage, vehicle observations, and digital traces could collectively support the hypothesis that this individual or someone within his immediate network had the opportunity to commit or assist in the crime. The introduction of DNA evidence marks a pivotal shift in the investigation, highlighting the interplay between modern forensic science and traditional investigative methods. What do you think? Is the genealogical lead sufficient to focus investigative resources, or does it require additional corroboration? Careful examination of patterns and consistency across evidence types remains essential in constructing a credible case. In the early hours following weeks of investigation, Brian Kohberger was taken into custody by law enforcement. His arrest was based primarily on forensic evidence, including DNA matches and digital data, which reportedly linked him to the crime scene. Authorities emphasized that procedural steps had been followed meticulously, with warrants issued and evidence verified before detaining him. Community members and students expressed relief that a suspect had been apprehended, with some viewing the arrest as the first step towards closure after a period of widespread fear and uncertainty. While the arrest provides a tangible focus for the investigation, contradictions remain. Despite the DNA link, some physical evidence, including certain fingerprints and footprints at the scene, has yet to be conclusively tied to Kohberger. Additionally, his movements leading up to and during the time of the crime are still under scrutiny. There are questions about whether surveillance gaps or unaccounted-for travel could suggest other possibilities. Public reactions range from immediate trust in law enforcement to skepticism over whether a single suspect can explain all elements of the crime. Could there be additional individuals involved, or might the evidence point to indirect involvement rather than direct execution of the crime? Is it possible that gaps in alibi verification leave room for alternative explanations? How does the DNA and digital data correlate with observed behaviors, vehicle sightings, and neighborhood reports from the night of the incident? These questions underline the need for cautious interpretation and continued investigation. Historically, high-profile arrests in multi-victim cases often follow a pattern. Initial evidence leads to a primary suspect, but further analysis frequently reveals complexities such as accomplices, prior interactions with victims, or misinterpreted digital footprints. In this case, Kohberger's arrest aligns with the pattern of leveraging forensic and digital leads to identify a probable suspect, while legal proceedings and corroborating investigation determine the completeness of the case. Patterns of online activity, recent purchases, or location tracking may provide additional context for motive or opportunity. It is likely that Kohberger's arrest reflects a combination of opportunity, digital traces, and timing. The convergence of DNA evidence, geographic patterns, and timing suggests he could have had the capacity to commit the attack, though further investigation is necessary to confirm motive and sequence of events. It is also possible that the arrest highlights the effectiveness of modern forensic methods, while reminding investigators and the public to avoid premature conclusions about intent or guilt until the full body of evidence is reviewed in court. The arrest offers both relief and new questions for the community. What do you think? Does this lead provide full closure, or are there elements that still require scrutiny? Following the evidence carefully without rushing judgment remains critical as the investigation and legal process move forward. As the case progressed through the courts, filings and exhibits exposed areas of uncertainty. Certain surveillance footage reportedly went missing, timestamps on digital records conflicted, and witness statements varied in key details. Legal teams highlighted disputes over the timeline of events, raising questions about when and where each victim was encountered and the precise movements of the suspect. Experts testified on forensic interpretations, emphasizing that even slight inconsistencies can significantly influence understanding of sequence and intent. Despite the apparent clarity of DNA evidence linking the suspect to the scene, contradictions emerge when timelines, witness recollections, and digital records are scrutinized. Some surveillance gaps challenge the exact chronology, and conflicting interpretations of phone data suggest that multiple scenarios remain plausible. While the arrest seemed decisive, these unresolved discrepancies reveal that the case is far from fully explained, leaving both investigators and the public with lingering uncertainties.
Could the missing footage have contained information that would confirm or challenge current theories? Might there have been overlapping events that are not reflected in the available digital and physical evidence? Is it possible that interpretations of movements and intent are biased by assumptions formed after the arrest, rather than the full evidentiary picture? How should investigators reconcile contradictory timelines to build a coherent understanding of what actually occurred? In complex multi-victim investigations, patterns often emerge where initial evidence identifies a primary suspect, but court scrutiny exposes gaps, missing data, or alternate possibilities. Historical precedent shows that court filings, expert testimony, and cross-examination frequently reveal nuances that were not apparent during the initial investigation. Patterns of digital activity, forensic sequencing, and witness recollection can sometimes shift or expand theories of motive, opportunity, or sequence, highlighting that arrests rarely close every question. Based on the evidence under review, it is likely that the suspect's involvement aligns with certain key findings: DNA at the scene, presence within the vicinity, and digital traces. But missing footage and timeline disputes suggest that some aspects of the event could remain unclear. It is possible that additional contexts, such as unknown interactions with victims or overlooked activity patterns, might clarify intent or sequence. The case demonstrates that even when a suspect is in custody, careful analysis of all evidence is essential to fully understand how and why the crime occurred. The investigation continues to unfold under the microscope of courts, experts, and public attention. What do you think? Does the evidence tell the full story, or are there pieces still hidden? Stay alert to new filings and findings, because in cases like this, every detail matters. As the trial progressed, the defense introduced alternate explanations that challenged the prosecution's narrative. Expert witnesses questioned interpretations of forensic evidence, including the timing of DNA deposition and the significance of digital activity. Certain sequences of events previously presented as linear were re-examined to suggest that the timeline might not be as definitive as initially believed. Legal filings emphasized inconsistencies in witness statements, highlighting that recollections can be fragmented, influenced by stress, or misremembered altogether. While the prosecution presents a clear sequence of actions, the defense points out that the same evidence could support multiple scenarios. For example, phone location data shows the suspect in proximity, but the context of those locations remains uncertain. Similarly, minor discrepancies in autopsy reports or the order of injuries may not change the fact of death, but could influence how the events are interpreted. These contradictions reopen questions about motive, opportunity, and intent. Could the suspect's digital footprint indicate presence without implying direct involvement? Might the sequence of injuries or interactions with victims suggest a pattern inconsistent with premeditation? Is it possible that overlooked environmental factors like unlocked doors or open windows provided opportunities unrelated to the accused? How much weight should the court give to circumstantial evidence when direct eyewitness accounts are limited? In high-profile cases, defense strategies often highlight alternate interpretations of forensic, digital, and testimonial evidence. Patterns emerge where evidence is technically accurate but inconclusive in defining intent. Historical cases show that challenging the narrative doesn't negate the crime, but forces deeper scrutiny of timing, access, and sequence. By presenting plausible alternatives, defense teams create space for reasonable doubt, which can shift public perception even before the final verdict. Based on the evidence under examination, it is likely that some aspects of the events could support multiple interpretations. It is possible that digital activity, witness inconsistencies, or minor forensic ambiguities might provide context that differs from the initial narrative. While these factors do not absolve the suspect outright, they suggest that understanding the full sequence and motive might require careful consideration of every detail, rather than relying solely on a linear storyline. The clash between prosecution and defense continues to fuel debate, leaving the public questioning the certainty of the narrative. What do you think? Does the defense cast legitimate doubt, or does the core evidence remain compelling? Follow the trial closely, because each filing, testimony, and new expert insight could reshape what we think we know. Even after the arrest, trial, and extensive media coverage, many aspects of the case remain unclear. Investigators continue to review forensic evidence, digital records, and witness statements. Certain details, such as the exact sequence of events on the night of the murders, the motivations behind targeting specific victims, and the presence of unidentified individuals near the scene, remain unsettled. Families of the victims and the broader community are left grappling with partial answers and ongoing speculation. Despite significant evidence presented during the trial, gaps and ambiguities persist. For instance, while DNA links suggest a connection to the suspect, questions remain about how and when it was deposited. Surveillance footage captures unusual activity, yet cannot confirm direct involvement. Eyewitness recollections vary under stress, sometimes contradicting digital or forensic timelines. These inconsistencies highlight the difficulty of drawing absolute conclusions from complex and fragmented information. Could there be elements of the crime that have yet to be discovered or analyzed? Might other individuals have been present without leaving clear evidence? Is it possible that some details, such as minor injuries, environmental factors, or overlooked digital footprints, could shed new light on the sequence of events? How do investigators reconcile partial evidence with the need for definitive answers?
Cases of this magnitude often reveal a pattern where answers emerge slowly, and each new piece of evidence can challenge previous assumptions. Unresolved aspects, such as inconsistencies in witness statements or gaps in forensic records, often indicate the need for continued investigation. Historical patterns suggest that high-profile crimes frequently remain partly unresolved until additional evidence or new technological methods provide clarity. Based on available evidence, it is possible that the crime involved more complexities than initially understood. It might be likely that multiple factors, personal connections, environmental circumstances, and timing interacted to shape the events. While the suspect's involvement is documented, there could still be missing pieces that explain certain contradictions or anomalies. A cautious, evidence-based approach suggests that the full story may only emerge with continued scrutiny, new testimony, or advanced forensic analysis. As this case continues to unfold, the public remains engaged and speculative. What do you think? Are the key pieces of the puzzle still missing, or have investigators uncovered most of the truth? Follow the updates closely, because each new finding could change the narrative and bring us closer to fully understanding what happened.